Hey everyone, this week I wanted to take a look at the Baroque in the Netherlands or the Dutch speaking world. We've been taking a look at the rise of the Baroque last week with Caravaggio and Gentileschi, and also how we see these ideas within sculpture with Bernini. And then we examined how these ideas moved to Spain with Velázquez. I also want to take a look at how we see these ideas moving northward, where we see some of that influence from Spain starting to affect the northern, what is known as the Low Countries, or also the Dutch-speaking part of the world. And then this is just a map of the Netherlands at the time, and so we're going to divide our discussion between the north and then the south. Both regions here speak Dutch, even to this day. I mean, the yellow is modern day the Netherlands, and then the green down here, the south, is modern day Belgium. Both of them speak the same language. At least half of Belgium speaks Dutch, or they call it Flemish there. This is the area known as Flanders. It's just a region in Europe. And the language that they say they speak is Flemish. And then in the north, the Dutch, they say that they speak Dutch, right? Same language for the most part, very similar to English, and speaking English in New York versus speaking English in London. It's kind of the same language. There's going to be some subtle differences, and that's kind of how it is here. And so what I want to take a look at is this kind of region in here. It's loosely united by a common language, and these ideas are going to transmit northward to this area. And I want to give you some socio-historical context to this to know what's going on at the time and what they're responding to, and why the ideas of Spain and Italy are moving to this specific region. For this, I want to talk about the 80 Years' War. The 80 Years' War was the Dutch-speaking world, right? So again, that's the Netherlands and then Flanders here, right? The Dutch-speaking world, kind of loosely united, and their desire to be freed from Spanish rule, right? We talked about how Charles V laid claim to much of Europe through his maternal and paternal grandparents, right? So he inherits land from in the Low Countries, also the Dutch-speaking world is known as the Low Countries, and then he also inherits land in Spain, and then he inherits some land in Italy, right? Well, by the mid-1500s, the Low Countries, or the Dutch-speaking world, wants independence, very similar to what we're going to see in the United States in the 1700s, right? Wanting that kind of ability to choose for themselves. They're tired of the king ruling them from Spain. They want to be able to make their own decisions, right? However, monarchs seldom give up their power willingly. In some ways, this conflict, the 80 Years' War, was very political to try to gain that political independence. But in other ways, it was also religious war, because Spain remained Catholic, and this area, particularly in the yellow here, was Protestant. Specifically, they were Calvinist. They adhered to Calvinist ideas, and so they wanted both political freedom and they wanted religious freedom as well. However, the green area here, Flanders, still maintained their Catholic roots, right? So they didn't really go to the Protestant ideas, and so this is going to be a problem in the Dutch-speaking world. There's kind of this rift between them. Yes, they speak the same language. Yes, they share the same kind of customs and history. Both of them want political independence from Spain. However, they do not agree in terms of religion. So this fractures their relationship and divides them, right? So both of them they want their independence, but they don't want the other region to gain more power than them. And so there's kind of this kind of conflict in between them, right? Now, the 80 Years' War, just kind of generally speaking about that, that's not to say that there was heavy conflict for 80 straight years. This is more of like a gentleman's war where, we don't fight when there's a holiday. We take Sundays off, and, if it's like rainy outside, we're not going to fight fight on those days. If it's winter, we don't fight during the winter, right? So it wasn't really a constant kind of battles. It was more of a series of uprisings. They would get together one day and they say, "Hey, we're going to cause a siege, or we're going to rebel, or we're going to attack this bridge," or something like that. I mean, it was a constant kind of conflict in some ways for 80 years, like it was ongoing, this resistance effort. But to say that they were just always on the battlefield for 80 years, that's not the case, right? Some further problems happen here. Charles V abdicates the throne, and abdicates just means he kind of gives up the throne. He's kind of tired of being the king. And so Philip II takes over, right, in 1556. And he has a little bit more hardcore beliefs. He kind of wants to clamp down and end this 80 years war. And what is all this? These people, shouldn't they just be grateful that I'm leading them? Kind of mindset. And so with him clamping down, there's this rising tension. And in the north, right, in that yellow region on the slide, they're just so frustrated politically, they're so frustrated religiously that there's this effort of iconoclasm. And we talked about that happening in other parts of the Protestant world, where this is the destruction of religious images, going into churches and destroying altar pieces or paintings or statues. And so we talked about how Luther mainly argues that religious images become false idols. And so that's already a rift, and now they kind of see this as a way to manifest their ongoing political frustrations as well. And so you have this major effort in 1566 to just destroy religious images within churches, and that's another way kind of politically to send the message to Philip II of Spain, who's Catholic, to saying, you know what, we're defying you, we're finding ways to kind of be passive aggressive and resist your rule. And then what he does, not necessarily in direct response to the iconoclasm, but just to clamp down on the revolts, he sends the military, led by someone named Duke of Alba, to end the rebellion. And what he does is he goes to Holland and he executes 1,000 people, right? So really clamping down on this, and it was seen as a very extreme move on the part of the king, right? And so then what happens is about 10 years after the iconoclasm, in 1576, Spain becomes bankrupt. And the problem is the king has a lot of mercenaries that's in the Low Countries, and they're not going to get paid. And we've already seen in Rome in 1527 what happens when Charles V's military wasn't getting paid. They sacked Rome. And so that's what we see happening in the Low Countries is the military of Philip II sacks a region in the green here known as Antwerp, right? So they go in and they sack Antwerp, and that's going to lay destruction to that area. But what it shows, right? So in some ways we might think of that as, hey, they're trying, this is a war. And so this is showing how this is kind of a victory for the king, but it's really not. It shows that Philip II has lost control of the military, and it shows more chaos. And so it's not really a good thing, even though he's at war with this particular region. And so what happens as a result of that kind of loss of control, is there was the Union of Utrecht, which was a region in the yellow here, right? This kind of union is just named after where they met to come together. And so Holland and Flanders, right? So these two areas in here, Holland and Flanders, unite. They just say, you know what? We have differences, yes, but we have a common enemy, right? So why don't we just put our differences aside and get rid of this king? He's lost control of his military. Let's stop fighting between ourselves and focus on fighting him, right? And so that's what they do, and they start gaining some major grounds. And so finally, what you have a few years later, so just about 4 years later, or sorry, 2 years later, you have the Act of Abjuration. And what the Act of Abjuration sounds like a big kind of fancy term, but essentially it just means Philip II gives up his claim over the Low Countries. He just says, you know what, they got problems over there that I'm not willing to deal with, and so he just kind of steps back from his active rule. And then the 80 Years' War, I mean, there's still kind of some tensions in that, but it's pretty much more peaceful after 1581. And then formally it's resolved with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. But this is all just to tell you about how this is affecting art, right? So we have Spain here. This is where Philip II is mainly ruling from. He also has claims to large parts of Italy, all the way down to Sicily. And then over in here, this is just modern day Switzerland and Germany. And then he has claim up here. And so he has this kind of claim to Italy, where the Baroque is kind of starting, transmitting to Spain, which we already have seen. And because they have this constant conflict with the Low Countries, we have the transmission of ideas also happening here. And so these ideas from Spain start moving northward and hitting these areas in Holland, right? Holland and also Flanders. All right, just as with the Peace of Westphalia, the Dutch Republic kind of gains its independence and starts functioning as its own kind of region. There is in the north what is known as Holland. This is modern day the Netherlands. And then there is the south, which is modern day Belgium, Luxembourg, and then northern France. And so it's kind of this region here. And so something that you need to know about Europe is we kind of think that the map of Europe, the way it is the way it always was. The boundaries of Europe were constantly in flux. In a 10-year period, you can go from living in Holland to living in now France, and then to living in now Germany, and your house hasn't moved, right? So the boundaries are constantly shifting with political alliances and whatnot. And so the boundaries that we think of today were not the boundaries of yesteryear, right? But that's just to say that we're going to take a look at the art in Flanders, and we'll take a look at the art in Holland. Both of them have similarities in terms of Baroque, but also some significant differences. Mainly these differences are a result of religious differences, right? The way that they see the world. The government that functions with this Dutch Republic of the North and the South coming together to unite is mainly they decided to have these united provinces that we're not going to all agree on everything, but if we can have some, general consistencies between regions, let each region kind of rule itself, but we'll kind of come together collectively with economic alliances, political alliances, and so we can have some type of relative peace. And so very similar to what we have in the United States with states, right? These provinces act as states, right? And then each one has an elected representative, kind of like a senator or part of the House of Representatives, and then they go and speak on the province's behalf, right? But it's not really, there's no really kind of king or major kind of leader within this context that's kind of suggesting this is the way we're all kind of doing. It's just a group of loosely tied area in this Low Countries of Holland and Flanders that kind of come together, right? And the question that they have to resolve, or they're constantly dealing with, is whether they want to be a strong republic, this kind of united entity that has one leader, one control, or do they just want to maintain their independence and just be, united provinces that act independently from one another, but have common interests in that. So that's going to be a constant tension. We have this in the United States between the idea of federalism, the idea of the federal government having more control, or whether states should have more control. And we're constantly having that kind of debate of whether the states should decide, terms of marriage or terms of abortion or terms of other kind of political disagreements that we have, or whether the federal government should be able to should decide those. And we're constantly, kind of shifting our thoughts on that over the years on where we fall within that as society changes. And so similar ideas were happening at the time. The main idea that I wanted to get to was this, though, right? So the idea of this Dutch Republic, mainly centered in Holland, is it establishes itself as the #1 economic powerhouse. And what we're going to see is, and we saw this with the Renaissance, wherever there's a lot of economic stability and economic power, economic might, art generally follows, right? So culture generally follows, right? The United States is the largest economic power in the world, and guess where the cultural center of the world is? It's right in New York City, right? And where is the economic center of the United States? New York City, right? So these things tend to correlate. Not that they're necessarily, there's this kind of causation effect, but there is a strong correlation between economic stability and cultural development. So if we're just focusing on trying to make ends meet and survive, culture takes a hit. But during times of prosperity, people start thinking about entertainment. They start thinking about culture. They start thinking differently. And so what we see is this economic boom that's happening as they gain their independence is going to bring major art to this region. And so for the 1600s, the Dutch Republic becomes the cultural center of Europe, right? It's very similar to what we saw with the Medicis causing that stability in Florence, and they become the economic and cultural center of Europe. We see similar transitions here, right? They had more money in terms of their economic power. If we adjust it for inflation in today's dollars, they have more money than every other nation today than the United States and China. So if we were to kind of factor in, right, adjusting for inflation and try to compare how much, GDP the Dutch had at the time, they would have more money than England, they'd have more money than Canada, they'd have more money than India, right, today, right? Thinking about how much money they have at the time, right? The Dutch didn't have a strong army or navy, right? That really wasn't their focus, but they had a strong economic market, right? And that's really what puts them on the map. They were a mercantile system and believed that he who controls the gold controls the world, right? Who controls the economic might controls the rest of the world. It was the idea that they built on their supply of gold, right? If they had more gold, other nations would have less. And so it's this idea of scarcity, a kind of a zero-sum idea of limitations, thinking about the world and the economic power of the world or the world's resources as one pie. You have to get as big a pie as you can, and that means that other people will have less pie, right? It's kind of an interesting idea. I think we kind of maintain that in the United States, that people are trying to get, become millionaires or billionaires or whatever, and there's that kind of urgency to say, I've got to get mine before the rest of the resources are gone. Other countries don't necessarily have that scarcity mindset. They just think that there's enough for everyone, and so we don't need to necessarily be so scarce in our kind of thought process. But because the Dutch Republic is Calvinist and the Puritans come over, they also are Calvinists. They're coming over and establishing a European settlement in the New World. We have a lot of Calvinist ideas rooted within our culture. And so there's a lot of these ideas that you'll notice that are happening in the Dutch-speaking world that are very similar to what we have in the United States, right? Because they're coming from this roots of Calvinism or Puritanism. So just thinking about this, what was it that they were mainly selling? They were mainly selling spices, right? And so as these areas, these markets that are opening up throughout the world in South America and Africa and Asia, there were all these spices that Europe never really had access to, right? The European palate was pretty bland. And so they get these spices coming in from all over the world, and they start tasting these foods, and they're saying, this is amazing. I've never tasted something like this. And so it becomes part of the rising merchant class or the aristocracy. They want access to these fine foods, right? They became foodies, as we would call them today. And so the spices were extremely expensive, and the Dutch would sail all over the world to get these spices, bring them back to the Netherlands, and then they would sell them throughout Europe, right? And so it was a very profitable endeavor for them, right? Because it was becoming more and more popular. However, right, here's some of the problems. Selling all over the world at the time was a very risky venture, right? A lot of ships wouldn't return due to getting lost at sea, due to storms, due to pirates, due to Captain Jack Sparrow. So you had a lot of issues that were happening. A lot of them didn't really. Some of them didn't make it out, and or make it back at least. And so what you have is a lot of money that's invested in building the ships, getting the crew of the ship, and then sailing over the seas. And then it would take maybe 6 months to kind of get there and get back. And so it was a long kind of adventure. And so you have a lot of upfront costs. And then the problem is maybe your ship is going to be lost at sea and you'll never see that money again. And so the Dutch invented something ingenious. They said, rather than investing in one ship, what if you invested that same money, right, that kind of 100% for a ship, and you divided that money up into 10 different ships? And so rather than owning one ship, you own 10% of 10 ships. And that kind of maximizes your ability to see a profit back, right? So if one of those ships, if one of those 9 ships gets lost at sea, you still have 9 ships coming back and 90% investment. And so they developed this idea of stocks, right? The idea of stocks comes from where they would put a ship and build it. They would put it in a stock or stockade, right? And they would build a ship around it. And so the idea that we have today of the stock market stems from this kind of concept, is that maybe we can invest in something, a portion of something, and then see a return, right? Now, the return was extremely profitable. Generally, it was about 5 times the initial investment. So think about this. If you were to give me $100 today and I would give you $500 next week, would you take that investment? And most of us would, right? And so it was extremely profitable, right? And so what happened is they developed what is known as the Dutch East India Company. And you see the logo here for the Dutch East India Company here. And it was extremely profitable, and it made a lot of people a lot of money in the Netherlands. And so what you have also happening at this time is that the churches are not buying art. And so there's that kind of gap in patronage. And so artists are turning to the merchants to be able to fulfill their commission. And so all of a sudden you have people with a lot of money to spend, and you have artists needing people to spend money. So it kind of works out, right? And so the United East India Company was financed by the Dutch Republic, who supplied a lot of money and arms for protection. And so the Dutch saw this as an opportunity to rid their rivals. And for the most part, the Dutch was the dominant country in the world for a time, right? For a time, they were kind of the economic powerhouse, and so they also become the cultural powerhouse. And so this is just a brief introduction to what's happening in the Dutch-speaking world. What we're going to do, I want to take a look at what's happening in the south, in Flanders, and then we'll take a look at what's happening in the north with Holland, and see how art is happening within these regions and how it's different, because religiously there's that divide. But together they kind of have this shared history, they have this common language, and so they're kind of working together for common goals, common objectives. Their art is going to really pick up in this area because of their economic stability. So again, just some kind of an overview of what to think about in terms of thinking about the Dutch area and the rise of Baroque in the region.